Welcome everybody. I'm Andrew Gallagher, the Regional Sales and Marketing Director for A&K in Europe here based in the Cotswolds. So welcome to our new series of webinars from A&K Europe. This year we've been forced into a strange role reversal. So instead of you not being able to travel into Europe, we must try and bring Europe to you. We always take great pride in the range of insider access activities that we can offer you and your clients, and we set about considering how we could give you a glimpse of some of these insider access moments, but obviously from a distance. We've already brought to you the original works of Michelangelo inside his house in Florence with our sales manager Silvia Palucci in Italy. You can see that on a previous post. And to do something different to a museum, our thoughts turn to another period of uncertainty in history, the Cold War. Today I have the pleasure to introduce you to Pavel Pashchenko. He's the personal English interpreter to former Soviet Union President Mikhail Gorbachev. Pavel works as an interpreter at the United Nations and later to the Soviet Union Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He participated in various arms control negotiations, as well as in every US-Soviet summit meeting leading up to the end of the Cold War. Pavel's one of the leading interpreters of his time. Today he continues to work as an interpreter at international conferences and major international organisations. Pavel's been a good friend of Abercrombie & Kent for a number of years and participated as a guest speaker in many programmes for which our company operated. Of various university alumni groups, museum groups, as well as individual guests in Russia, Pavel speaks on a broad scope of subjects such as lessons learned from ending of the Cold War, the US-Russian arms race, and danger of a new Cold War. So today he'll speak on the history of the outcomes of the Cold War, as this topic is always of great interest to our guests. So we thank you for your time, we thank Pavel for taking his time, and we hope you enjoy this webinar. So thank you very much.
Inviting me. This is not the first time that I'm talking to tourists and tour organizers. Actually, I've been giving these talks in Moscow and also during the cruises for quite a few years. And among the subjects that I talk about is the Cold War and the lessons that we learned from the Cold War, or perhaps have not learned from the Cold War. It's also about how leaders, including Mikhail Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, ended the Cold War. So those talks normally last for 45, 50 minutes. I will have to compress both themes, both subjects, the Cold War and how the Cold War ended, into 40, 45 minutes. This will not be easy, but I will try so that we still have 15 minutes for Q&A. So the main questions about the Cold War are on this first slide. When did the Cold War start? Was it inevitable? What was it about? So I'll try to cover these questions and also the questions of when the Cold War ended. How did it end? And are we today in a new Cold War? Obviously, this last question is a difficult one, so let us first talk about how the Cold War started, the protagonists of the Cold War. Paradoxically, the protagonists of the Cold War were the people who were allies during World War II, during the war against Nazism. And Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin worked together to defeat Hitler, but they were not able. And also President Truman of the United States were not able to prevent the post-war situation from degenerating into a Cold War. The bomb, the nuclear bomb, played a very important role in the Cold War and in the fact that the Cold War began. Perhaps it could have been a different story had the nuclear bomb, not been developed. Also, my own view is that perhaps had President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States not died in 1945, we would have had a different story. Certainly, Stalin, by his policy of communizing Eastern Europe, of imposing a communist system on Eastern European nations, contributed significantly and perhaps decisively to the Cold War, contributed significantly to the confrontation between the East and the West. However, perhaps the West too could have taken a different path and tried a less confrontational response to Stalin's attempt to impose communism on Eastern European nations. This is for historians to decide. But certainly the West, having a monopoly on nuclear weapons between 1946 and 1949, also took a rather confrontational attitude toward the Soviet Union. So the attempts to end the Cold War started in the 50s, after Stalin's death. Could Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader who succeeded Stalin, and Dwight Eisenhower, the American president, a general who fought in World War II and was one of the major actors in defeating Nazism, could they have ended it? Was that a possibility? This is a question that is often asked. My answer is they tried. They tried. They made an honest effort. However, it turned out to be very difficult. One of the reasons for it was that the two nations did not have the diplomatic experience, the experience of previous mistakes from which they could have learned. And so the various incidents, the various things that are inevitable in relations between great powers, their disagreements that are inevitable even when the nations are not divided by different ideologies. Those disagreements took on an oversized scale, an oversized aspect. For example, one can say that the attempt by Eisenhower and Khrushchev to end the Cold War and to start on a more cooperative path went down in flames when an American spy plane, U-2, was shot down over the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. The United States wanted information about Soviet arsenals of nuclear weapons. By that time, the Soviet Union too had nuclear weapons. It had missiles, it had bombers with nuclear weapons. So the United States wanted information about it. And so it sent spy planes that it thought were invulnerable to Soviet rockets or to Soviet fighter planes who could have shot it down. But on this one occasion, the spy plane, the U-2, was shot down by a Soviet rocket, and the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, ejected from that plane and was then captured by the Soviet military on the ground. And this incident, which of course was a lot of unpleasantness, which of course was a difficult episode, as I said, took on an oversized scale because Nikita Khrushchev said, well, if you are spying over our territory, then I cancel the summit with President Eisenhower. So, on the one hand, the United States should not have done what it did, spying over the sovereign territory of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, obviously, Nikita Khrushchev overreacted. But then they tried again. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev met with the young American president, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was young. John F. Kennedy wanted peace. Khrushchev too wanted peace. Perhaps they both wanted to end the Cold War. But their summit meeting was not well prepared. They basically played it by ear. They did not succeed in establishing a political and a personal rapport, which is absolutely necessary for two leaders to build trust and to engage in some kind of a cooperation, in a negotiation. So that is an interesting example of two basically well-intentioned leaders who were not able to engage because of the poor preparation for their summit. It didn't work. And because it didn't work, the Cold War not just resumed, but it increased in intensity, and that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which fortunately, because in the final moment, both Khrushchev and Kennedy displayed wisdom, that crisis did not end in a war, did not end in a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. But basically, one can say that that generation of leaders did not succeed in ending the Cold War. But then their successors, Brezhnev and Nixon, tried again. This is a photo of the summit meeting between Leonid Brezhnev and Richard Nixon. And in addition to trying to improve relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, they also tried to end the arms race. The arms race was the inevitable consequence of the Cold War. The threat from the other side was often exaggerated. It is often overstated. And the result is that the other side not just responds, but runs ahead of that country which it sees as a threat. So, Brezhnev and Nixon tried to end that spiral of the arms race. They tried to put a cap on the numbers of nuclear weapons, in particular strategic nuclear weapons. And also they tried to constrain the missile defense systems that both sides were developing. So, once again, those two men did make an honest effort to end the Cold War, but they too did not really succeed, even though they concluded the first nuclear arms limitation agreement, which was called the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Here you have the photo of Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signing the ABM Treaty. ABM is missile defense, but missile defenses contribute to a race in offensive arms. So instead of an unlimited deployment of missile defenses, they decided to significantly limit the number of defensive systems that both sides could deploy. And that was a great achievement. So they did a good job. Even though they did not really end the Cold War, they at least ended a race in anti-ballistic missile systems. And what emerged as a result also of an agreement to limit the number of nuclear missiles and bombers was called détente. That's a French word that basically means the easing of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. So here you see Leonid Brezhnev and the American president who succeeded Richard Nixon when he had to resign, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev met in the easternmost city of the Soviet Union, Vladivostok, and they discussed further limitations on nuclear arms, nuclear weapons, to limit not only the number of missiles and bombers, but also to limit the number of warheads, of nuclear warheads that they can carry. That was a big challenge because no one knew at that time how to verify the number of warheads per each missile or bomber. So they had to address this. And unfortunately, they did not succeed. So the result was that even though the number of missiles and the number of bombers were kept, were limited to a certain ceiling, the number of warheads that could be installed on each missile and bomber was not limited in any way, and the arms race, the nuclear arms race, unfortunately resumed. Then comes the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is a treaty that Leonid Brezhnev signed with Jimmy Carter, the third American president with whom he dealt. And it was a good treaty. It was a treaty that, at least to some extent, also limited the number of warheads. It did not limit them enough, unfortunately. The buildup of nuclear weapons continued throughout the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s, but nevertheless, the SALT Treaty was an attempt, at least an attempt, and in part a successful attempt to limit the number of nuclear warheads. But then détente, the easing of tensions, collapsed. It collapsed primarily because of the invasion of the Soviet Union into Afghanistan and the American reaction to that invasion. Afghanistan is not a place, in my view, that is so strategically important that you have to basically ruin the whole relationship between the great powers, the US and the Soviet Union, because of Afghanistan. It was a mistake to move into Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, but it was also a mistake by the United States to overreact to that unfortunate development. And so the United States announced that it will not ratify the SALT Treaty, the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Nuclear Weapons. Détente collapsed, the relationship was frozen, and that continued for at least 6 years. For 6 years between 1979 and 1985, the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States did not meet. There were no summits, there were no new agreements, and the old agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States were in jeopardy. This was a dangerous period for the US, for the Soviet Union, but also for the world. The two sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, were deploying nuclear missiles of intermediate range also in Europe, not just in the United States and the Soviet Union, not just in silos and on submarines, but also mobile nuclear missiles in Europe that could reach the territories of the Soviet Union and the European countries. This was a moment of great tension in relations between the Soviet Union and the West. I was working at that time in the Soviet Foreign Ministry. I participated in various negotiations and talks to try to end that particularly dangerous situation, but unfortunately, those talks, those negotiations did not succeed. Now, this is the cover of the book by the former ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock. It is about how the Cold War ended, Reagan and Gorbachev, how the Cold War ended. I recommend that book for those of you who are interested, but I also would like to frankly recommend my book and to talk a little bit about myself and about my participation in ending the Cold War, and specifically in the talks between Leonid Brezhnev, between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. This is an interesting picture. It's in French, and the question in French that is shown here is who makes it possible for important people to understand each other. So this is a picture where it is shown who did it. It's a picture of Reagan, Gorbachev, and myself. I am honored to have participated in that process, and I'm honored to have worked with those leaders. I will share some of my recollections about the meetings that ended the Cold War. This is a picture of the first talk between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in Geneva in November 1985. Their meeting was by no means a love fest. It was not an easy meeting because there was so much mistrust and misunderstanding that had accumulated during the 6 years when there was no high-level contact between the leaders of those two nations. Nevertheless, those leaders were able to agree on a joint statement that said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And they also emphasized the importance of preventing any war between them, whether nuclear or conventional. They also pledged not to seek to achieve military superiority. That agreement in principle was of enormous importance because it kind of changed the tune for the two nations, for their militaries, for their diplomats. It was a call to them to engage, to negotiate, and to end the nuclear arms race that had by that time produced over 50,000 nuclear warheads in the arsenals of those two nations. The next meeting was in Reykjavik in October 1985, where they discussed the specifics of arms control agreements. And very often the question is asked whether Reykjavik was a failure or a breakthrough. Initially, our American colleagues called Reykjavik a failure because the two presidents discussed the parameters of nuclear arms agreements, and they agreed on most of those parameters regarding strategic weapons, intermediate range weapons, and they discussed their common desire to ultimately eliminate, abolish all nuclear weapons. You know that President Reagan had that dream about a kind of Star Wars system that would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete because he hated nuclear weapons. The Star Wars system, the system of total missile defense, turned out to be a pipe dream. But it also reflected President Reagan's hatred of nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev shared that hatred. So when the meeting in Reykjavik ended, he announced that even though agreements were not reached because President Reagan insisted on Gorbachev's approving the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars system, and Gorbachev could not do that. But even though they disagreed on that one point, Gorbachev said this was an important meeting. It was actually not a failure, but a breakthrough, because he said we agreed on so many other things, and we hope to conclude agreements on reducing the arsenals of nuclear weapons, and because also we both share the dream of a world without nuclear weapons. So Time magazine said no deal, but Gorbachev and then Reagan agreed that this was an extremely important summit. The arms talks continued. George Shultz, the Secretary of State of the United States, came to Moscow, and our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Edward Shevardnadze, went to Washington several times in order to hammer out the specifics of the first arms reduction agreement. That was the agreement on eliminating and destroying the missiles of intermediate range, INF missiles. So in December 1987, that first agreement that actually eliminated two categories of nuclear weapons, land-based intermediate and land-based shorter range missiles, the agreement that for the first time was a real arms reduction agreement rather than just an arms limitation agreement, was signed in Washington in December 1987. An extremely important step forward in reducing the arsenals of those two nations. Even today, those arsenals are enormous, and the Soviet Union, Russia as a successor to the Soviet Union, and the United States still have over 90% of the overall arsenals of nuclear weapons. That is to say, all the other nuclear powers, including China, Great Britain, France, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, taken together, have less than 1/10 of the number of warheads in the arsenals of Russia and the United States. So we still have enormous numbers of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy civilization. But 85% of the arsenals held by the United States and the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War have by now been destroyed. They've been all decommissioned. Most of them have been destroyed or are in the process of being destroyed. And so December 1987 is when this process started, and we hope that it will continue. So these are some pictures of that first successful summit, of the summit that began to end the nuclear arms race and the Cold War. The atmosphere is very different. Trust is emerging between the leaders, but much work, of course, remains to be done. This is the departure ceremony at the White House after the signing of the first arms reduction agreement. As you can see, it's a rainy day, but it was a great day. President Reagan came to Moscow in the summer of 1988. This is perhaps the most memorable picture from that summit. Reagan and Gorbachev took a walk on a Red Square. And during that walk, they talked very warmly to Soviet citizens. And then after they passed the Red Square, they returned to the Kremlin. And I remember the moment very vividly when, after they returned to the Kremlin, they stopped by a group of reporters, American and Soviet reporters, who asked them questions. And one of the reporters asked President Reagan this question: Mr. President, do you still regard the Soviet Union as an evil empire? You know that Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire. That was in the early 1980s when she had just become the president of the United States. And so he was, I think, very candid, very frank when he said that. But on this occasion, when she was asked whether he still regarded the Soviet Union as an evil empire, he was equally candid. And he very simply said, no, no, that was a different time, a different era. Now the Soviet Union, under the leadership of President Gorbachev, is changing, and we expect that we will continue to work together to end the nuclear arms race and to ultimately abolish nuclear weapons. So that was perhaps the moment of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. That's, in my opinion, the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Moscow, July 1988, when President Reagan recognized that he no longer regarded the Soviet Union as an evil empire. So this is again President Reagan and President Gorbachev against the background of St. Basil's Cathedral, one of the most beautiful sights of Moscow. It's right on Red Square. They're posing for photographers, and basically they, in this way, recognize that the two nations were no longer enemies. They no longer regard each other as evil. Now, the next US president with whom President Gorbachev dealt is George Bush, the first President Bush, as we call him. President Bush basically continued the policy of President Reagan. He too worked with Gorbachev to reach an agreement on limiting and reducing the numbers of strategic nuclear weapons. So those weapons that can reach the territory of the other side from their own territory. That was an extremely difficult process. The START Treaty, the first START Treaty that was signed by Gorbachev and Bush, consists of hundreds of pages of the treaty text and the various protocols and statements attached to that treaty. So it was enormous work that needed to be done. It took, I would say, too much time, but ultimately it succeeded. So we can say that those three persons, Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, worked together, and the three of them deserve credit for ending the Cold War and ending the arms race. So this historic photo of the three leaders against the backdrop of the Statue of Liberty in New York, it's truly historic, and I think it symbolizes the cooperation of those three men in ending the Cold War. The official end of the Cold War perhaps was at Malta in December 1989, when President Gorbachev said to President Bush that we are ready not to regard the United States as an enemy, that we want to be partners. And they shook hands on that statement. The two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States, stood together during the crises that followed that momentous announcement of the end of the Cold War. In particular, they cooperated in reversing the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. A very important moment. This is when Secretary of State Baker and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze learned of the fact that Iraq had occupied Kuwait, and they immediately agreed that they would work together. In Helsinki in September 1990, Gorbachev and Bush reaffirmed the end of the confrontation and reaffirmed that they will work to reverse Iraqi aggression against Kuwait. Finally, in Moscow, in July 1991, Bush signed the START Treaty, reducing the number of strategic nuclear warheads and missiles by 50%, cutting in half those enormous arsenals. Another great achievement. So where Reagan was 3 years before, here are Gorbachev and Bush repeating the same walk in Red Square and reinforcing, I think, the impression that those two nations were no longer enemies. The summit in Moscow was very informal, very productive. You can see here the two presidents very much at ease with each other. They discussed the possibility of partnership in ending various regional conflicts and continuing nuclear arms reductions. That was an extremely promising moment in relations between our two nations. So that's how the Cold War ended. Not say that today we are in a particularly fortunate situation as regards relations between Russia and the United States. I described my experience of efforts to end the Cold War in the book that you can still order from Amazon.com. It's called My Years with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. Even though it was published 25 years ago, it is fortunately still in print, and you can learn a lot more from my memoirs about my experience. But why are we today talking about a difficult relationship between Russia and the West, between Russia and the United States? This is because the benefits of ending the Cold War were to a significant extent ruined by subsequent events. In particular, the NATO enlargement, which was seen in Russia as very unfortunate and as a new dividing line in Europe. So this perception of NATO as a threat is still very much a fact in Russia, and that was the first step toward the unraveling of the new relationship between Russia and the West. The United States and generally the West, after the end of the Cold War, were not treating Russia as an equal. They declared victory in the Cold War, even though ending the Cold War was a common victory. Russia was not happy with that kind of declaration of victory in the Cold War. Then the actions of the United States and NATO in Yugoslavia. You may know that Belgrade in Serbia was bombed in 1999 because of the conflict in Kosovo. Another step toward the unraveling of the new relationship between the Soviet Union, between Russia and the United States. Then George W. Bush withdrew from the ABM treaty. Remember, I mentioned that treaty, the treaty on limiting the missile defense systems. That again was seen by Russia as a hostile move by the other side, by the United States. Finally, relations seemed to be on track again when President Medvedev, at that time the president of Russia, and President Obama of the United States signed the New START treaty, the treaty that cut the numbers of nuclear weapons, of strategic nuclear weapons, also quite substantially, and limited the remaining nuclear weapons. But then again, it began to collapse. It began to collapse when the relationship between Russia and the U.S. turned sour, and the personal relationship between Obama and Putin turned sour. And then in Russia, at least, there were hopes that relations will pick up with the new president when Donald Trump was elected. This is a photo of their first and only summit in Helsinki in 2018. But then President Trump announced the U.S. decision to withdraw from the INF treaty. So the U.S. has by now withdrawn from two very important treaties with Russia, the ABM treaty and the INF treaty. Where do we go from here? How do we build a relationship or rebuild the relationship when the United States keeps withdrawing from treaties and destroying the foundations? Well, my recipe, my prescription for how we can end the current bad phase in US-Russian relations is, first of all, dialogue. Establish dialogue. Work for success, but don't hope for miracles. It takes time and patience to achieve a result. Keep your eyes on the goal. Do not get off course when stuff happens, such as incidents, spy scandals, mutual allegations, and things like that. Keep your eyes on the goal. The current important goal is to extend the New START treaty signed by Presidents Obama and Medvedev. Keep your eye on that goal. The spy scandals and various incidents and mutual accusations are not nearly as important as the goal of saving the world from the prospect of nuclear war, as the goal of further reducing nuclear arms, as the goal of making sure that the two nations that can actually destroy each other do not do so. And then go for win-win. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It has to be a win-win game where both sides win. This worked with Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, and this can work again, and hopefully it will.